They told me who the enemy was before I ever met a single soul from that land. They showed me images, loud, violent, heartbreaking, and then whispered in the background, terrorists, over and over again. So I believed them. I believed what I saw, not realizing that the lens I was looking through was never mine to begin with. But life has a way of showing you what truth really is when you're willing to listen. I remember the first time I stood in that land. I had no agenda, just questions. I wanted to see it for myself, to understand why the world seemed to turn its back. And what I found wasn't hatred, it wasn't violence, it wasn't the stereotype I had been handed and told to accept. What I found was something sacred. I met a mother who had lost everything, but still shared her bread with me. I met children who laughed, even though they played in rubble. I met men whose prayers didn't call for war, but for peace, for mercy, for healing. I saw eyes that had seen too much pain, yet still held light. And something shifted inside of me. I wasn't there for a religious awakening. I wasn't looking for a new path. But sometimes the truth grabs hold of you in a way that doesn't ask for permission. It whispers to your soul, not your ears. And what I saw, what I felt, changed me. It wasn't just the strength of the people, it was their peace. Peace in the way they moved. Peace in the way they prayed. Peace in the way they smiled even when the world had forgotten them. And I asked myself, how can people who live with so much loss, so much pain, carry so much grace? There was a spirit in the air, in the call to prayer, in the tears that fell with dignity, in the silence after the bombs, when people still bowed their heads and whispered, Alhamdulillah. Minwa's face lit up with a beautiful glow within him. He took his comment and hid it in the sand, breaking the narrative. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes narratives are written by those with the loudest microphones. And when you grow up hearing the same story again and again, it becomes your truth, even if it was never true to begin with. For years, the world has been told who to fear, who to blame, and who to turn away from. We are handed labels before we meet people. We are taught caution before curiosity. And in the case of Palestine, so many of us were taught a version of the story that left out the most important parts, the people. We were told they were dangerous, that they were angry, that they were driven by hate, that their faith was part of the problem, not the solution. But here's the thing, when you only hear one side, you miss the humanity, you miss the laughter, you miss the mothers putting their children to bed with lullabies in the middle of airstrikes. You miss the boys playing soccer in alleyways, the old men drinking tea at sunrise, the girls braiding each other's hair, dreaming about college, about love, about peace. When I went there, I realized something no headline had ever told me. The people the world called terrorists were just people trying to live, people holding on to dignity, people with dreams like mine. And that shook me, because I realized how easy it is to demonize someone you've never met, how easy it is to swallow a story that paints others as monsters, just so we don't have to challenge our own comfort or perspective. The narrative had been broken, not by some big political debate or viral video, but by presence, by seeing it myself, by looking into the eyes of a child who had lost her brother, yet still smiled at me with warmth, by hearing a father speak of forgiveness even after his home had been turned to dust. I learned that power doesn't just lie in weapons or governments. It lies in stories. And sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply tell the truth, not the polished truth, not the convenient truth, But the real, raw human truth, that's what happened to me. The labels didn't hold up when I saw the love, the faith, the resilience. The narrative that had been drilled into me unraveled, piece by piece, replaced by a deeper understanding, one that made me question everything I thought I knew. And once you see people clearly, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to silence. You can't accept the lie, because now you know truth doesn't always come from the loudest voices. Sometimes it comes from the quiet strength of the people who have been through hell and still choose to rise with love. When everything around you is broken, when buildings are turned to rubble and silence follows the sound of bombs, you don't expect to find beauty. You don't expect to find kindness. But somehow, in the middle of all that destruction, I found humanity. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, powerful. It was a woman handing me a piece of bread with shaking hands, apologizing for not having more. It was children who had lost their siblings, still inviting me to play with them in the dirt, still laughing like children should. It was a teenager who stopped in the middle of his own grief to ask me how I was doing. That's not the kind of humanity you find in peaceful places. It's the kind you find in people who have lost everything but still refuse to lose their soul. I saw families pray together after losing their homes, whispering words of peace into a sky that had not been kind to them. I watched men help their neighbors rebuild what was already destroyed, not because they believed it would last, but because helping is what you do when you still have hope left in your chest. That hope, that stubborn refusal to let go of love, is what broke me open. Because the world told me to expect hate, I expected anger, I expected bitterness, but instead I saw resilience. I saw warmth. I saw people with every reason to close their hearts, choosing instead to keep them wide open. One day I sat with a mother who had lost her son. She didn't cry when she told me his story. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. And at the end she said, "God is still good." I remember that moment because it felt like everything I thought I knew about strength suddenly changed. That was real strength, not vengeance, not shouting, not fighting. It was her peace, her faith, her refusal to let pain turn her into something she wasn't. What I saw there didn't fit the headlines. It didn't match the images I'd grown up seeing, and I realized you can't understand a people until you sit with them. You can't judge their faith until you've seen what it looks like in action, in real life, in real pain, in real love. I saw a humanity that wasn't crushed by chaos. It lived through the chaos. It held hands, it shared meals, it prayed with strangers. It forgave the unforgivable. That kind of humanity doesn't make the news, but it made its way into my heart. And once it was there, I knew I couldn't go back to who I was before. Because now I had seen there's something sacred about being present, truly present with another human being. Not watching through a screen, not reading someone's story through a filtered headline, but standing there, heart open, eyes open, soul open, witnessing someone else's truth unfold right in front of you. When I arrived in Palestine, I thought I was going there to observe, to learn, maybe even to help. But what I didn't expect was how much being there would change me, not because I did anything special, but because I stopped trying to analyze and started to feel. I stopped trying to fix and started to listen. And in that listening, I was transformed. There's a different kind of knowing that happens when you look someone in the eye while they're telling you about the day they lost everything. When their voice shakes and they pause, not to cry, but to breathe. Because crying is a luxury they've already done too much of. You feel every word. You carry it with you because it's no longer a story, It's a person, a living, breathing soul sitting across from you. I sat in rooms where silence said more than words. I held hands with people who didn't speak my language, yet somehow we understood each other perfectly. Because presence doesn't require perfect words. It requires willingness. It requires stillness. It requires being uncomfortable and staying anyway. I remember sitting on a floor with a family who had lost 3 generations to one airstrike. No furniture left, just a rug, a few cracked cups, and a kind of peace I couldn't explain. They didn't rush to tell their story. They just invited me in. They offered tea. They asked about my family. In that moment, it wasn't about politics or religion or war. It was about people. It was about the simple act of being together, of saying, I see you, I honor your pain, and I will not turn away. That kind of presence is powerful because it gives dignity. This doesn't try to erase someone's suffering or change the subject. It simply says you matter. And for people who have been silenced, ignored, and misrepresented for so long, presence becomes a form of love, a form of resistance, a form of healing. What I learned is that you can't understand someone's faith, their strength, or their love from a distance. You have to get close. You have to sit with their sorrow and still see their beauty. You have to let your heart break a little. And when it does, something new gets built inside of you. Something softer, something wiser, something more awake. That is the power of presence. It doesn't fix the world, but it changes you. And when you change, you move through the world differently, you speak differently, you love differently. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the world begins to heal. One moment of presence at a time. Finding spiritual beauty in struggle. There's a kind of beauty that doesn't shine, it glows softly in the dark. Doesn't shout, it hums quietly through the pain. And I found that kind of beauty not in comfort, not in abundance, but in struggle. In the places the world forgets, in the faces of people who have nothing left but their faith, and somehow that faith becomes everything. I had never seen spirituality like I did there. It wasn't performative, it wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, it was real. It lived in the way people whispered prayers while walking through rubble, in the way they said, Alhamdulillah. Praise be to God, not just when something good happened, but especially when everything fell apart. At first I didn't understand it. How could they still believe? How could they still be grateful? But over time I realized that their faith wasn't rooted in outcomes. It wasn't about what they had or didn't have. It was about surrender. A deep, unshakable trust in something beyond what the eyes could see, and knowing that even in loss there is mercy, even in pain there is purpose. I saw women who had buried their children, still waking before dawn to pray, to raise their hands to the sky, to say thank you for breath, for survival, for one more sunrise. I saw men fasting during times of deep grief, using their hunger not to suffer, but to cleanse, to connect, to remind themselves of a higher calling. That's not religion in theory, that's faith in motion, that's belief as a way of life. And it was beautiful, not because it was perfect, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Their struggle was not wrapped in despair, it was covered in patience. Their tears weren't signs of weakness, they were evidence of deep strength, the kind of strength that bends but doesn't break, the kind of strength that says, even now I trust my Lord. That shook me, because where I come from, faith is often something you turn to when life is good or when it's convenient. But here, faith was the only thing people had left, and it was enough. It held them. It gave them dignity. It gave them peace in the middle of chaos. And slowly I began to see the world differently. I stopped asking, why would they still believe? And started asking, how could I not? I saw how their struggle carved out space for something sacred, how suffering became a bridge to something divine, how love for God in the middle of hell made them radiant. I went there thinking I would see tragedy, but I saw something far more powerful. I saw people living in the heart of hardship, shining with a light I couldn't explain. That light was their faith. That light was Islam. And in that light, I saw the beauty I didn't know my soul was searching for, a shift in consciousness. There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew starts to crumble, not in chaos, but in clarity. Moments when your heart understands something your mind can't quite explain. And for me, that moment didn't come with a grand revelation. It came quietly, gently, in the middle of conversations, silences, prayers, and the way people carried themselves with grace in the face of suffering. It was a shift, not just in belief, but in consciousness. I didn't go looking for faith. I didn't wake up one day and decide to change my life. It happened slowly, piece by piece, like puzzle fragments falling into place. I began to see the world through a different lens, not one built on fear or stereotypes, but on truth. And the truth was, the people I met had something I didn't, a depth, a peace, a center that didn't shake, even when everything around them was collapsing. At first, I admired it from the outside. I watched how they spoke to each other, how they honored their elders, how they paused everything for prayer, even in the most uncertain moments. I saw how their faith wasn't something they performed, it was who they were. It wasn't just part of their life, it was the ground they stood on. And that groundedness did something to me. I started asking different questions, not about religion, but about meaning, about what I had been chasing, about why, with all my freedom and all my success, I still felt like something was missing. Why was it that these people who had lost so much seemed more whole than I had ever felt? That question kept echoing inside me until it finally broke something open. It was no longer about right or wrong, us or them, tradition or rebellion. It was about truth, about alignment, about peace, not just around me, but within me. And slowly I realized that the peace I had been searching for wasn't something to be found in the world. It was something to be remembered, something already planted inside of me, waiting to be awakened. That awakening didn't come with fire or lightning. It came in the middle of a quiet prayer I didn't understand at the time, but felt with every part of me. It came when I stood still long enough to feel God in the silence, in the simplicity, in the surrender. That's when everything shifted. I stopped looking at Islam as a religion I didn't understand and started seeing it as a way of life I deeply resonated with. Not because someone preached to me, not because I was convinced, but because my soul recognized something familiar, something true. It wasn't a decision, it was a return. A return to something ancient, something divine. A shift in how I saw the world, how I saw others, and most importantly, how I saw myself. Unity through understanding begins when we stop talking and start listening, not just to words, but to pain, to history, to silence. So much of the division in our world comes from distance. We fear what we don't know, we judge what we don't understand, and we repeat what we've been told without ever asking who said it and why. But something powerful happens when you step into someone else's world, not to fix them, not to debate them, but simply to understand. I didn't grow up knowing much about Islam. What I did know was shaped by headlines, fear, and half-told stories. I was handed a version of people I had never met, and I believed it because it was easier to accept the narrative than to question it. But everything changed when I met the people behind the story, when I looked into their eyes, when I sat in their homes, when I listened, not to defend or argue, but to learn. And the more I listened, the more the walls inside me began to fall, because understanding doesn't require agreement. It doesn't even require shared experience. It just asks that you show up with an open heart. I saw firsthand how much beauty lives in difference, how deeply people care for one another, even across language and culture. And I witnessed how faith can be a bridge, not a barrier, how Islam, so often misunderstood, is built on compassion, mercy, justice, and love. And I realized that we don't have to share the same path to share the same humanity. I saw people who had every reason to hate choosing to love, people who had been dehumanized still treating others with dignity, people who were wounded yet welcoming. Their kindness wasn't performative. It was built into their way of life. It was part of their worship. And in that, I saw a kind of unity I hadn't known before. Real unity isn't about everyone looking the same or thinking the same. It's about recognizing the sacred in one another. It's about seeing that beneath every belief, every culture, every story is a human heart longing to be seen, heard, and valued. And when we allow ourselves to truly witness each other, to sit with each other's grief, to celebrate each other's joy, that's where unity begins. The world doesn't need more opinions. It needs more understanding. It needs people brave enough to unlearn what they were taught and humble enough to admit when they were wrong. It needs people who are willing to cross invisible lines, not to erase differences, but to honor them. I found unity not by changing who I was, but by expanding who I could love, by letting go of fear and leaning into connection. And in that connection, I found healing. I found truth. I found Islam. And I found that the path to peace isn't paved with sameness. It's built on the courage to understand.